Have you ever noticed how the most effective battles are often fought in complete silence? Think about it for a moment. While everyone else is making noise, creating drama, and announcing their struggles to the world, there's a different kind of warrior who understands something profound about how real victory works. This warrior knows that the most powerful battles aren't won with loud declarations or public displays of strength, but in the quiet, sacred moments when no one else is watching. TOZER, one of the most insightful spiritual teachers of the 20th century, understood this secret better than almost anyone. He discovered that the Christian life isn't about putting on a show or impressing others with our spiritual activities, but about developing an inner life so rich and deep that it transforms everything we touch. When we learn to fight our battles in the silence of God's presence, something miraculous happens. We stop being defeated by the same old struggles. We start walking in a power that others can't quite explain, and we discover what it really means to live as a spiritual warrior. If you've been exhausted by trying to fix everything through external effort, if you're tired of feeling defeated by the same battles over and over again, then this message might be exactly what you've been searching for. The strategy we're about to explore isn't just another technique or formula. It's a complete transformation of how we approach every challenge, every struggle, and every victory in our spiritual journey. Most people today have completely misunderstood what spiritual warfare actually looks like. We've been conditioned to think that being a spiritual warrior means being loud, aggressive, and constantly engaged in external battles. We see people shouting at their problems, rebuking everything in sight, and making grand declarations about their faith, but somehow they keep fighting the same battles year after year. Tozer lived in a time when this same confusion existed, though it looked different then. In his era, people thought spiritual victory came through religious activity, church attendance, and following all the right formulas.
They were busy, they were involved, they were doing all the things that looked spiritual on the surface, but many of them were dying inside. They had religion, but not relationship, activity but not intimacy, noise but not genuine communion with God. Tozer watched this phenomenon with growing concern because he understood something that most people missed then and still miss today. He saw that the most powerful spiritual battles aren't fought in public at all.
They're fought in the secret place, in the quiet moments when we're alone with God, in the silence where our souls meet with the Almighty and real transformation takes place. This isn't just a nice idea or a comforting thought. It's the actual secret to spiritual victory that most believers never discover. In our current culture, this misunderstanding has only gotten worse. We live in a world that values noise over depth, performance over authenticity, and quick fixes over lasting transformation. Social media has made everyone a performer, and sadly, this mentality has crept into our spiritual lives as well. People post about their struggles, announce their victories, and turn their faith journey into a kind of spiritual theater where they're always on stage. But here's what Tozer understood that we need to grasp today. The real battles that determine the quality of our spiritual lives happen away from all the noise, away from all the performance, in the sacred silence where only God can see. When we learn to fight our battles there, everything changes. The anxiety that used to control us loses its power. The anger that used to explode begins to dissolve. The fear that used to paralyze us starts to fade, and we begin to walk in a quiet confidence that comes from knowing God intimately rather than just knowing about Him. The problem we face today is that most of us have never been taught how to access this secret place of victory. We've been given plenty of advice about what to do externally, but very little guidance about how to develop the inner life that actually produces lasting change. We know how to pray out loud, but we don't know how to listen in silence. We know how to ask God for things, but we don't know how to simply be with Him. We know how to fight against our problems, but we don't know how to find peace in His presence. This creates a cycle where we're constantly exhausted, constantly struggling, and constantly disappointed because we're using external methods to fight internal battles. It's like trying to fix a broken heart with a bandage. It might look like we're doing something helpful, but it doesn't address the real issue. Tozer saw this pattern in his own time and called it out with the kind of loving boldness that only comes from someone who has found a better way. He discovered that when we learn to meet God in silence, when we develop the discipline of quiet communion with Him, when we stop trying to impress others with our spiritual activities, and start focusing on knowing God personally and intimately, our battles begin to be won before we even engage them. This isn't because we become perfect or because our problems disappear, but because we begin to draw from a source of strength and wisdom that's far greater than our own efforts. Let's dive deeper into what this actually looks like in practice. Because this isn't just theory, it's a completely different way of living that changes everything. When TOZER talked about the secret place of victory, he was referring to what he called the inner sanctuary of the heart, where God meets with us personally and intimately. This isn't a physical location, it's a spiritual reality that's available to every believer, but discovered by very few. Most people pray to God, but they rarely take time to simply be with God. Most people talk to God about their problems, but they rarely listen to what God wants to say to them about their hearts. Most people ask God to change their circumstances, but they rarely invite God to change them from the inside out. The secret strategy that TOZER discovered involves learning to access this inner sanctuary regularly, consistently, and with the kind of expectation that comes from knowing that God actually wants to meet with us there. Here's how this works in real life. Imagine you're facing a situation that normally would send you into anxiety, worry, or anger. Maybe it's a difficult relationship, a financial pressure, a health concern, or a decision you need to make. The normal human response is to immediately start trying to fix the situation, control the outcome, or worry about all the things that could go wrong. But when you've learned the secret of silent warfare, you do something completely different. Instead of immediately reacting, instead of jumping into action mode, instead of letting your emotions take control, you step back and enter into that inner sanctuary where God is waiting to meet with you. You don't go there to beg God to fix everything. You go there to remember who God is, to reconnect with His character, and to allow His peace to transform your heart before you take any external action. This isn't passivity. It's actually the most powerful form of spiritual warfare because you're addressing the root of the battle rather than just fighting the symptoms. In this place of quiet communion, something remarkable happens. Your perspective begins to shift. Your emotions begin to settle, and you start to see the situation from God's viewpoint rather than just your own limited understanding. You begin to remember truths that you know in your head, but hadn't been living from your heart. You remember that God is in control even when circumstances seem chaotic, that His love for you isn't dependent on everything working out perfectly, and that His strength is available to you regardless of how weak you feel. Most importantly, you begin to receive the specific wisdom and guidance that you need for this particular situation. Not generic advice that you could find anywhere, but personal, intimate direction that comes from spending time with the one who knows you better than you know yourself. This is what TOZER meant when he talked about God revealing Himself to those who truly care, who take the time to seek Him not just for what He can do, but for who He is. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it doesn't just help you handle the current situation better. It actually begins to transform the way you approach all of life. When you make a habit of meeting with God in silence before reacting to challenges, you start to develop what TOZER called spiritual reflexes. Instead of your first response being worry, your first response becomes prayer. Instead of your first impulse being to control, your first impulse becomes to trust. Instead of your first instinct being to react emotionally, your first instinct becomes to respond from a place of peace and wisdom. This doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't mean you become perfect, but it does mean that you begin to win battles before they even fully develop, because you're fighting them from a position of spiritual strength rather than emotional weakness. Let's look at another practical example of how this works. Think about those internal battles that everyone faces, but few people talk about openly. The battle against pride, against selfishness, against the constant need to be right, or to have others think well of us. These are the kinds of battles that can't be won through external effort alone, because they're rooted in the condition of our hearts. You can't overcome pride by trying harder to be humble. You can't defeat selfishness by forcing yourself to be more generous. And you can't conquer the need for approval by simply deciding not to care what others think. These battles are won in the secret place where God gradually transforms our hearts, where He shows us the beauty of His character in such a way that we begin to desire what He desires, where He fills us with His love so completely that we're not desperate for love from others, where He gives us such a secure sense of His approval that we're not dependent on human approval for our sense of worth. This kind of transformation only happens in the silence, in the quiet moments when we stop performing and start being real with God about who we actually are and what we actually struggle with. Tozer understood that most people never experience this kind of deep change because they're too busy trying to look spiritual rather than actually becoming spiritual. They're too focused on what others can see rather than what God sees. They're too concerned with their reputation rather than their character. But when we learn to bring our real selves into the secret place with God, when we stop pretending and start being honest, when we stop trying to impress God and start letting Him love us as we are, that's when real spiritual warfare begins to happen. God starts to show us things about ourselves that we couldn't see before, not to condemn us, but to free us. He starts to reveal areas of our hearts that need His healing touch, not to shame us, but to restore us. He starts to expose lies we've believed about ourselves, about Him, and about life itself, not to hurt us, but to set us free with His truth. The third aspect of this secret strategy involves learning to rest in God's presence even when we don't understand what He's doing. This might be the most challenging part for most people because we're so accustomed to needing to figure everything out, to have a plan for every situation, and to feel like we're in control of our circumstances. But true spiritual warriors learn to trust God's heart even when they can't trace His hand. They learn to be at peace even in the middle of uncertainty because their security comes from their relationship with God rather than from their circumstances being perfect. This doesn't mean they become passive or irresponsible, but it does mean they learn to take their actions from a place of faith rather than from a place of fear or anxiety. When you're in the middle of a difficult season and you don't know how things are going to work out, when you're facing a challenge that seems bigger than your ability to handle, when you're dealing with disappointment or loss that doesn't make sense, this is when the secret place becomes absolutely essential. This is when you need to know how to find God in the silence, how to receive His peace that surpasses understanding, and how to draw strength from His presence rather than from your own resources. In these moments, the battles aren't won by fighting harder. They're won by surrendering deeper. They're won by learning to trust God's character even when you can't understand His methods. They're won by choosing to believe that His love for you is constant, even when His actions don't make sense to your limited perspective. This is where many people get stuck because our culture has taught us that strength means never giving up control, never admitting we don't have all the answers, and never appearing vulnerable or uncertain. But spiritual strength is completely different. Spiritual strength comes from knowing that we're held by someone who is stronger than we are, wiser than we are, and more loving than we are. It comes from learning to rest in His capabilities rather than striving in our own limitations. It comes from discovering that we can be completely honest about our weaknesses because our identity and security are rooted in His strength rather than in our own performance. Now let's talk about how to actually implement this secret strategy in your daily life, because understanding the principles is only valuable if you know how to put them into practice. The first step is creating space for silence in your routine, and this might require some significant changes in how you structure your days. Most of us are so accustomed to noise, activity, and constant stimulation that the thought of regular silence feels uncomfortable or even impossible. But this is exactly why it's so necessary. Our souls need silence the same way our bodies need sleep. And just like we have to be intentional about getting enough rest, we have to be intentional about getting enough quiet time with God. Start with just 10 or 15 minutes each day, preferably in the morning before the demands of the day take over your attention. Find a place where you won't be interrupted, turn off your phone, and resist the urge to fill the silence with a lot of words. Instead of immediately launching into requests or complaints, begin by simply acknowledging God's presence. Remind yourself that He is there with you, that He loves you, and that He wants to spend this time with you. Don't worry about having profound thoughts or spiritual feelings. Just focus on the reality that the Creator of the universe has made Himself available to you personally and intimately. This isn't about performance, it's about relationship. As you spend time in this place of quiet attention to God, pay attention to what happens in your heart and mind. You might notice thoughts that you've been suppressing, emotions that you've been avoiding, or concerns that you've been carrying without even realizing it. Don't try to fix everything or figure everything out right away. Just bring these things into God's presence and let Him begin to work on them. Sometimes he'll give you specific guidance or insight. Sometimes he'll simply give you peace about a situation you can't change. And sometimes he'll show you how your perspective needs to shift. The key is learning to be receptive rather than always being the one who's talking or demanding. One of the most practical ways to develop this habit is to connect it with specific challenges you're facing. When you notice yourself getting anxious about something, instead of immediately trying to solve the problem or calling someone to talk about it, make your first response to step into that place of silence with God. When you feel anger rising up in response to someone's behavior, instead of reacting immediately or stuffing the emotion down, take it to the secret place and let God show you what's really going on in your heart. When you're facing a decision and you feel pressured to choose quickly, discipline yourself to spend time in God's presence first, asking not just for the right answer, but for the wisdom to see the situation from His perspective. This approach will feel unnatural at first because we're so trained to react immediately to everything that happens to us. We've been conditioned to believe that quick responses are always better, that immediate action is always necessary, and that silence means we're not doing enough. But the secret strategy that TOZER discovered works in exactly the opposite way. It teaches us that the most powerful response is often not immediate, that the most effective action comes from a place of peace rather than pressure, and that silence is actually where the real work gets done. When we learn to fight our battles in the secret place first, we often find that the external battles become much smaller or sometimes disappear entirely because we're addressing the root issues rather than just managing the symptoms. Another practical element involves learning to recognize the difference between God's voice and all the other voices that compete for our attention throughout the day. In the silence, you'll begin to notice that there are many different thoughts and impulses running through your mind. Some of them come from your own desires and fears. Some of them come from the influence of other people in your life. Some of them come from the culture around you, and some of them come from God Himself. Learning to distinguish between these different voices is a crucial skill for spiritual warriors because it determines what you end up following and therefore what kind of life you end up living. God's voice tends to be characterized by peace, wisdom, love, and alignment with His character as revealed in Scripture. It doesn't contradict His written word. It doesn't promote selfishness or harm to others, and it doesn't create anxiety or fear in your heart. God's guidance often comes with a sense of rightness that goes deeper than just logical reasoning. Though it never contradicts sound logic, it frequently involves a call to trust Him more deeply, to love others more genuinely, or to grow in some area of character or faith. Most importantly, God's voice always points you toward Him rather than toward yourself, toward His glory rather than your own reputation, and toward His kingdom rather than just your personal comfort or success. As you practice spending time in silence with God, you'll begin to recognize these characteristics of His voice more easily. You'll start to notice the difference between His gentle guidance and the harsh demands of perfectionism, between His loving correction and the condemning voice of shame, between His invitations to trust and the fearful urgings of anxiety. This discernment becomes absolutely crucial for spiritual warfare because so many of our battles are won or lost based on which voice we choose to follow. When we learn to recognize and respond to God's voice consistently, we find ourselves making decisions that lead to life and peace, rather than decisions that create more problems and stress. The transformational power of this secret strategy becomes most evident over time as you begin to see changes not just in how you handle crises, but in the overall quality of your daily life. People who learn to fight their battles in the secret place with God develop a kind of spiritual stability that's not dependent on their circumstances being perfect. They have peace in the middle of uncertainty, strength in the face of challenges, and wisdom for complex decisions because they're drawing from a source that never runs dry. This doesn't mean their lives become problem-free, but it does mean they have access to resources that enable them to handle whatever comes their way with grace and confidence. You'll notice that your relationships begin to improve because you're not as reactive, defensive, or desperate for others to meet needs that only God can truly satisfy. You'll find that your work becomes more fulfilling because you're operating from a sense of purpose that goes beyond just earning money or gaining recognition. You'll discover that your responses to disappointment and difficulty become more mature because you have a foundation of trust in God that doesn't depend on everything working out according to your plans. Most significantly, you'll begin to experience the kind of intimacy with God that makes all the external activities of faith feel meaningful rather than just obligatory. This is what Tozer meant when he wrote about the pursuit of God. He wasn't talking about trying harder to be religious. He was talking about discovering the incredible reality that God himself wants to be known personally and intimately by each of us. He understood that most people spend their entire lives trying to earn God's approval through their behavior, when what God actually wants is relationship, communion, and fellowship with his children. The secret battles are won when we stop performing for God and start enjoying God, when we stop trying to impress him and start letting him love us, when we stop working for him and start walking with him. As you begin to implement this approach in your own life, remember that it's a process of growth rather than a technique for instant results. Some days, you'll remember to go to the secret place before reacting, and some days, you'll forget and have to come back to God after you've already made a mess of things. Some times of silence will feel rich and meaningful, and other times will feel dry or distracted. Some battles will be won quickly and easily, while others will require longer seasons of patient trust and persistent prayer. All of this is normal and part of the journey of learning to live as a spiritual warrior who understands where real power comes from. The beautiful thing about God's character is that he meets us wherever we are in this process. He doesn't wait until we're perfect at finding him in silence before he begins to work in our lives. He doesn't require us to have all the right spiritual disciplines in place before he starts answering our prayers. He doesn't expect us to overcome all our struggles immediately before he begins to transform our hearts. Instead, he works with us gradually, patiently, and lovingly, as we learn to turn to him more consistently and trust him more completely. Every small step toward him is celebrated. Every moment of genuine seeking is honored, and every sincere attempt to follow his voice is blessed, even when we don't do it perfectly. This is the heart of what makes this strategy so different from other approaches to spiritual growth and victory. It's not based on your ability to perform perfectly. It's based on God's desire to be in relationship with you personally. It's not dependent on your strength or wisdom. It's dependent on his character and faithfulness. It's not about earning victory through your efforts. It's about receiving victory through his grace. When you understand this, the whole process becomes less about pressure and more about privilege, less about obligation and more about opportunity, less about fear and more about love. The secret strategy to winning your battles in silence isn't really a strategy at all in the way we normally think about strategies. It's actually a way of life, a different approach to everything, a complete reorientation of where we look for strength, wisdom, and security. It's learning to live from the inside out rather than the outside in, to draw from spiritual resources rather than just human resources, and to fight battles from a position of intimacy with God rather than just determination and willpower. When this becomes your normal way of operating, you'll find that many of the things that used to defeat you no longer have power over you, not because you've become stronger in yourself, but because you've learned to tap into a strength that's far greater than your own. This is the invitation that's available to you right now, regardless of what battles you're currently facing, regardless of how many times you've tried and failed before, regardless of how impossible your situation might seem. God is waiting to meet with you in that secret place where real transformation happens, where genuine victory is won, and where the most profound battles of life are fought and won in silence. The only question is whether you'll accept this invitation and begin to discover for yourself the incredible power that's available to those who learn to wage warfare, not with noise and drama, but with quiet confidence in the God who fights for those he loves.